Okay, I'm gonna get started now. Hope everyone had a happy Pesach. I didn't realize when I set the schedule for this class that today's topic, which is the Holocaust, would fall on the week of Yom HaShoah, which is, of course, Wednesday night and the Thursday of this week. But it's some things work out the way they work out. So I'll remind you all now, not going to make announcements later, that our Yom HaShoah service is 7:30 on Wednesday evening. It's in person to synagogue, and you can also follow it along on the live stream. So we're going to put some stuff on the screen. I want to talk about some overall questions. Again, if you're not on mute, I'd ask you to put yourself on mute, please. I'm going to talk about some overall questions that our historians ask as they talk about the Holocaust. And then after that, I want to spend most of the time going through one of the books that I had recommended. But we'll get there in a moment. Let me just put the share screen here. Okay, so this is, hold on, slideshow. Okay. So we're talking about the legacy of the Holocaust. The legacy of the Holocaust is more actually the last two classes. As the last two classes, we will be discussing anti-Semitism in Israel and then anti-Semitism in the United States, and both exist within the heavy shadow of the Holocaust. But we'll talk today about some of the interpretive ways that the Holocaust is understood and how that leads to the legacy that it leaves behind. And what we can see here, like put on the screen here, these are sort of basic questions that historians ask about the Shoah, about the Holocaust. The first one is a technical issue. Is it understood as a functionalist or essentialist phenomenon? What that means is a lot of historians of the Holocaust divide up into these two basic rubrics. The essentialists argue that it was always the intent, was always Hitler's intent, at least to commit a genocide against the Jewish people and to completely destroy all of the Jews in Europe and everywhere where he was able to do so. The functionalist, or sometimes it's called structuralist approach, is different. They argue that that the goals, the anti-Semitic goals of the Nazi regime evolved over time, meaning that they were always fueled by anti-Semitism, but the initial program was to restrict Jews' sector and involvement in the economy. And we see when Hitler comes to power in 1933, the Nuremberg laws are enacted 2 years later in 1935, and they restrict the interaction of Jews economically, professionally, and also socially. Marriages are restricted between Jews and Aryans. The Nuremberg laws get into the nitty-gritty of the definition of how to define a Jew, how to define a non-Jew, and of course the revocation of citizenship, which is the emancipation that we talked about the last class that we had, which was 2 weeks ago. Then the program of the Third Reich moves along where there's a push towards getting the Jews to emigrate, to leave Germany. And about half of the German Jews do manage to get out. Those efforts end once the war starts at the end of 1939, because then when in a state of war, civilians are not able to easily cross frontiers, which we know certainly from watching the struggles of so many people trying to get out of the Ukraine now. And then what's called euphemistically called the final solution, many historians argue, well, functionalist historians argue that was the only option left because there was no place to put the Jews. And that as they kept pushing the Jews out of Germany, the borders of Germany were expanding faster than they can push the Jews out. So they had to restrict the Jews geographically into the ghettos, and then the liquidation of the ghettos through the through the death camps with the technology of mass murder that was developed at Auschwitz and elsewhere. So those two understandings, did it develop along the way, or was it always the intent to kill the Jews, raises issues in terms of how to understand what was the nature of the anti-Semitism. Was it always murderous? The second box here is then that leads us to thinking about the anti-Semitism itself. Is it religious or eliminationist? Eliminationist anti-Semitism is genocidal or really racist. It's just the idea of eliminating this whole slew of people. Whereas the more traditional anti-Semitism is a religious-based anti-Semitism, which is what we've been tracking through most of the sessions of this class, right? Where it's the anti-Judaism that developed through through Christianity and through the relationship of Jews living in the Christian world. And what we see that changes, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago, how this change happens in the 19th century, that anti-Semitism secularizes. And racism, or the racist anti-Semitism, is a secular anti-Semitism. It's no longer the same as again, if you're not on mute, I'd ask you please to put yourself on mute. It's not the same as the religious anti-Semitism that we experience in, as I said, in most of the story that we've talked about in this class. And the most obvious example is because it didn't matter to the Nazis whether the Jew accepted baptism. Before the modern era, a baptized Jew was accepted as a Christian, although we did see the exception of that in 14th century Spain. And we talked about there, that was the beginning of the more modern racist anti-Semitism. But that brings us to a general question about the Holocaust. Is the Holocaust medieval or modern? Those that talk about the Holocaust as medieval understand it as a sort of a last gasp of the medieval, undeveloped, dark, pre-civilized European culture that was not ready to accept difference and the different that we have in the modern world, in the globalized, liberal, interconnected world that we live in today. And the other group understands the Holocaust is really modern, as something very different from the anti-Semitism of the medieval and the ancient world, but that is triggered by the pressures of the modern world. And that's the argument that, well, I'm gonna show how that's argued by Götz Ali, who's the historian that we're going to look at closely today. In the last box here, and this is another issue among historians of modern Germany, has to do with the German path to the Third Reich. Was it a determinist, or historians call it a special path, or was it an accident of history, and the turn to totalitarianism could have happened in other places as well? The ones that argue the special path take the point that Germany was always anti-Semitic and was always driven by this ultra-nationalism and the sense of being the master race over others, of which the Jews were the opposite of the master race, right? They were the minority that was to be despised and to be hated. And many historians have questioned and criticized this called the special path of Germany, in arguing that there are many twists and turns, and so much of modern liberalism also develops in Germany. And one of the arguments that I've made elsewhere is that there's a moral issue there as well, that if we understand the worst type of anti-Semitism as something that's specifically German, we let everyone else off the hook. And we shouldn't be so easy on everyone else in the world in that sense. And also a sense understanding that all people are capable of doing terrible things. And if we understand the path that led to the Holocaust as something that's specific to the specific circumstances or nature of Germany and German culture, then we fail to learn any lessons that we can take from that, which has to do with the sense of legacy that we talked about. I added the rational or irrational because irrational was the term from the medieval historian Gavin Lagmere that we talked about when we did the medieval blood libel, and his argument was there's a turn to an irrational anti-Semitism that has no basis in reality. And that we're not going to apply that rubric to understanding the Holocaust, but the reason why I bring it here is that much of the debate about what were the intentions, right? Was it essentialist, or was it intentional, the genocide, the destruction of the Jews, or was it something that developed? Another way that that question is asked is, were Hitler and the other Nazi leaders out of their minds? Or was there some reason or explanation to why they did what they did? Were they simply driven by an irrational hatred of Jews? Or is there a way that we can explain it? And if there's a way that we can explain it, then we can learn certain lessons and see where there are dangers elsewhere. And that's a more challenging, but probably ultimately, I think, more constructive approach to what we're looking at. So just to show some examples of books, this was already about, this book's from 1997, 1996, it's a bit dated already, but it was a bestseller at the time by Daniel Jonah Goldhagen called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And he takes the special path argument in this book. He argues that I'll read you from the back. It says, reconstructs the climate of eliminationist anti-Semitism that made Hitler's pursuit of his genocidal goals possible, and the radical persecution of the Jews, and showing how in Germany the Jews were always seen as unalterably evil and dangerous, and that's why most Germans followed the Nazis and collaborated with the policies of the regime. Again, this was a bestseller. It was very popular in both the United States and in Germany. Most historians panned it, and the most it's a shorter book, but the most popular book that took the opposite view is this book called Ordinary Men. When I taught German Jewish history, I've mentioned these books. Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, and The Final Solution in Poland by Christopher Browning. He was also a very, very respected historian of the Holocaust. And what he did there, he looked at the archive of one group of reserve officers who were older. They served in Poland, older in that they weren't educated under the Nazis. They were educated when Germany was a democratic republic called the Weimar Republic, and saying these are basically ordinary people and how they turned to doing terrible things. And his basic argument is that it's nothing specific about their upbringing, nothing specific about their culture. It's rather the radicalized element of being in a war. And being in a war, people do things that they wouldn't do in normal times. So that's a different perspective there. Finally, the historian, and then one other book, probably the best book just to read about the Holocaust in general is, and this is also was a bestseller, did very well. It's called Why? Explaining the Holocaust by Peter Hayes. And Peter Hayes was the Holocaust historian and was the chair of the academic committee that provided oversight to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington. It's a very succinct, it sort of covers all the basic history, the basic issues, how things developed. So it's probably the clearest read just on the history of the Holocaust itself. But I want to talk about Götz Ali, who is a very important German historian and also historian of the Holocaust. And the most important book that he did, although there's two more recent ones, the key book is called Hitler's Beneficiaries. Yeah. Plunder, Racial War, and the Nazi Welfare State. This book was published in 2005. And the argument that he makes in this book is that there's an economic element that, because the question is always asked, right? Yes, we know that Hitler was evil, right? And the Nazi leaders were evil, but how much of the responsibility is shared by all of the people who collaborated and participated and made the Holocaust happen, everyone down the line? And why did they do that? Why did they allow it to happen? And he argues, and this book focuses mostly on the German part of the history, that there was an economic incentive. and that Hitler had bought off Germans' participation in the Holocaust through the plunder, the distribution of Jewish assets. And that argument he carries down in two more recent books, which are probably both easier reads. This one is called Why the Germans, Why the Jews? Envy, Race Hatred, and the Prehistory of the Holocaust, which was published in 2011. And then most recently, and this was the book that I recommended to read of this class, Europe Against the Jews, 1880 to 1945, of which the English translation was just published in 2020. So in both of these books, he sort of crystallizes the argument he makes in Hitler's Beneficiaries. And what's important about the new book, Europe Against the Jews, is saying that it's not just Germans, right? That the Germans had help in all of the countries that they occupied in Europe. And that when people refused, then the Germans relied upon the locals to help arrest the Jews and persecute the Jews, discriminate, and eventually bring them to deportations to Auschwitz and elsewhere. And that in the few exceptions, the rare exceptions when the occupied countries did not, then Jews were saved, like in Denmark, where the royal family refused to pursue an anti-Jewish policy. And they say, if we're forced to do this, then we're all going to wear the Jewish stars ourselves. Another example was not all of Belgium, but the mayor of Brussels and the neighboring cities said they absolutely refused to persecute against, discriminate against any of their citizens. And the Nazis were not able to compel the Danes or the area in Belgium around Brussels to do anything. They might have at some point, but most of the Jews from those areas were saved. If this were a regular class, right, we would have read. Sorry, excuse me. All right, again, if you are not on mute, it's hard for me to control. It's hard for me to control the mute when I am also have the screen share. So please keep yourselves on mute. Thank you. If this were a regular class, we would have theoretically read the book and discussed it. But since I don't expect there to be reading outside of class, yeah, it is. And I'm just looking at Stacy's point, the economic, is it socioeconomic? Yeah, it is socioeconomic, not purely economic, and we'll see that. But since we didn't read this, what I'm going to do today is just take you through basically Gutzali's conclusion, and then we'll have some time to talk at the end of the class. So most of these screens were places that I took from his book. From his book. Let me back up here. Here we are. So all these passages are quotations from Europe Against the Jews. So here's, we're starting at the end. So I'm jumping you to 301. So you get credit for the first 300 pages easily. So this is his last chapter. He talks about, and this was, for me, it was the most chilling chapter to read. It was about the stony reception of the Jews received after the Holocaust upon returning home. The title of the chapter was The Return of the Unwanted. And he talked about leaving the DP camps after liberation, after they able to get their strength back, be able to travel. All these survivors, many managed to go back to their villages, to their cities, to their homes, and other people would be living in their homes. And they would, and they said, well, we live here now. And, they were ignored, they were shunned. And they would even go to the neighbors where they or their parents had left their being sent to concentration camps. And then they went back to those neighbors to retrieve their belongings. And then they would say, I don't know what you're talking about, or, the Russians came and took everything, and they would just give some excuse. And he gives many examples from people's memoirs, but then this is a joke that I think he says is all too telling. He says, a Jew encounters a Christian who asks him how he's doing. That's a stupid question, the Jew responds. I was in a concentration camp. Now I have nothing but the clothes on your back. And that kind of says it all there. Right, and they weren't able to procure back in very rare circumstances were they able to take back any of the things, even if it was right in front of their eyes. They would go to their neighbors and see the furniture from their homes in people's apartments, and they would refuse to acknowledge that it was their furniture. So collaboration is the term that used all the time. He uses this term confluence of interest. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were not part of what Hungarian politicians, in this case, he's talking about Hungary. He writes about all the different European countries in the book. So this could apply to any of the other countries here too. So it says the gas chambers of Auschwitz were not part of what Hungarian politicians and ordinary Christians envisioned, but stripping Jews of their wealth and deporting them to destinations unknown certainly was, right? That everyone was okay with doing. And for that reason, it is not enough to speak of Hungarian collaboration with Nazi Germany. There was a congruence of interest. And then is this quantitatively here. Within 3.5 years, Germans murdered 72% of the Jewish population in the places they ruled, almost always with the passive or active support of local administrations, police, political parties, and ordinary anti-Semitic citizens. Professor Ali is walking a complicated, delicate path here, because he's a German historian. He's a Christian German, right? So he says at the beginning of the book, he says, the responsibility for the Holocaust rests completely with Germany, responsibility for World War I, but for World War II rests completely with Germany. Yet the Germans had a lot of help, and the extent of the Holocaust would not have gone anywhere near the extent had it not had that help. And he's in this book, he's explained why this was a European action against the Jews and not just a German action against the Jews. So he's not shifting blame to Europe. He's just saying that it was a broader phenomenon. And then this point at the end, 6 years after the end of the Second World War, more than half of the Jews who had escaped the German machinery of murder and lived outside the Soviet Union voluntarily left Europe. You got to think about that. It's extraordinary there that, yes, 72% were murdered, but of the Jews that survived, most of them left Europe within 6 years. The Soviet Union is a special case because the Soviet Union, they couldn't really get out, right? They were kind of stuck there. But in the free countries of Europe, that the Holocaust is over, they've been liberated. And we're not just talking about Germany, right? We can say, I understand why a German Jew would not want to live in Germany after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, because their country turned against them. But is that necessarily the case in the other countries, the countries that were occupied, that were conquered by Germany during World War II? And yet most Jews didn't want to stay anywhere in Europe. And his point there is that everyone turned against the Jews, that there was a complicit collaboration. And that's what he is, in the book, he step-by-step traces all of that. I call this the promise curse of the 19th century. This is the interesting argument that he makes. And we were talking about this a bit a couple of weeks ago also with how modern anti-Semitism grows out of modern politics. Remember, just to remind you, we had said that after World War I, we have the idea of the self-determination of nations, right? And the creation of nation states out of the broader imperial sovereignties. And while that seemed like a good idea, the problem with a nation state that's functioning as a democracy is it puts the minority at a disadvantage because the majority rules. That's how democracy works. Now, the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations tried to correct for that by having guarantees for minorities, but none of those, they were called minority treaties, but none of those were in the end upheld, and the League of Nations had no real enforcement power. But look at this overall statement here. Before the nationalist movements in Europe achieved political predominance, their theorists, this is going back to the mid to late 19th century, standardized national languages, codified national myths, folktales, and legends, and selectively wrote down the narrative of a history understood in nationalist terms. Nationalists, who were usually in the political opposition and considered themselves committed Democrats, advocated compulsory education to combat widespread ignorance in the populace, right? We think of nationalists as being right-wing conservatives, but no, the nationalists were not conservatives, because because the nationalist doesn't want a multi-ethnic imperial government. They want a nation state. So they're not conservative, and they started off as liberal, and they wanted the people to have a say and vote rather than to be ruled. And part of that program was compulsory education in order to teach the national language, the national myths, the legends, and educate their people with the ideas of the nation. So compulsory education develops in the 19th century as a part of this, the nationalism and nationalist movements. And they battled against the privileges of the aristocracy and the clergy. They supported the modern, that privileges should be equitable and egalitarian. They supported the modern administrative state and demanded an independent judicial system, freedom of the press, free and secret elections, the creation of a robust national middle class, and better opportunities in life for everyday people. And Europeans still enjoy their efforts today. And we can add our country, United States, as well. In a sense, these are all good things, right? We're grateful for all of these things. And yet they also led to terrible things as well, which we'll see. This starts with tariffs, which we think, what's so problematic about protective tariffs? The idea of a protective tariff, and I remember when I was in high school, or had a debate in my social studies class in 9th grade over whether there should be tariffs to protect the American auto industry because everyone's buying Japanese cars, because the Japanese cars are a little better and they're a little cheaper. So people prefer to buy Japanese. So we should have tariffs that make the Japanese imports more expensive to protect the American auto industry. So it seems like, whether you're pro-tariff or not, what we've seen in the last just 20, 30 years, the whole debates over globalization, right? And the idea of NAFTA and whether there should be, and the Brexit with the UK breaking away from the European Union, is that the protective tariffs that is to protect your nation, and goes again, and globalism in the sense of an interconnected world sort of runs against that. And we've seen how that plays through in recent elections. What happened then? Wanting to help their people get back on their feet, the political leaders in the old and in particular new nations, right? New nations post-World War I supported restrictive tariffs and their domestic analog, which is laws and decrees disadvantaging minorities, especially Jews. That's the point that Ali is saying there, that discrimination against minorities is the domestic analog of tariffs against foreign imports. Because I want to protect American labor against things made abroad and foreign imports. I also want to protect American workers against foreign workers in this country, against immigrants. And in Europe, the Jews were the other that were in country, right? There were other minorities as well, but the Jews were the paradigmatic minority. So if you have laws and decrees disadvantaging Jews, then that will open up jobs for the real Hungarians or Poles or Germans or Italians or French. The idea of nationalization, a euphemism for expropriating what was owned by people branded as foreigners, right? So we talk about nationalization. Oh, nationalization sounds good. It's for the nation. It's a euphemism for taking things that are owned by other people whom the majority brand as foreigners, harmonized well with the idea of a social welfare state. And this is his idea of Hitler's really selling the program of the Third Reich as part of a social welfare state. Why that and this goes to what does Nazi mean? I was explaining that 2 weeks ago. It's National Socialist. It's an abbreviation for National Socialist. And what does nationalism and socialism have in common? Many people, many historians explain, well, Hitler was combining all the different parts of the electorate to get everyone to vote for him rather than appealing to just a particular sector of the electorate. And that was how he got votes. And again, he only got a third of the vote, but it was enough to form a governing coalition in a parliamentary system. But what Gutzeli is saying is it's more than that, that this is a national social welfare state is providing social equity for the majority. It's protecting the majority. So it bridged the division between socialists and social democrats, especially when it negated property rights of the Jewish capitalists, the Jewish bankers, the Jewish speculative investors, right? Those are the bad guys. And I didn't write, I want to read you just from the rest of the paragraph that I didn't type out. General battle cries like La France pour les Français, right, which means France for the French, or Polska dla Polaków. I'm sure my Polish is mispronounced, which means Poland for the Poles, were all too often specifically directed against Jews. More and more, concepts like the national economy connoted that the entire economy rightfully belonged to an ethnically defined people, and that interlopers had parasitically enriched themselves by claiming the best parts of it. The logical conclusion from all this was to turn away Jewish refugees and force foreign Jews to emigrate, if need be, by governmental pressure and the enlistment of popular rage. So it's that raising up of populist concern to the sense that I'm going to protect the majority interest. And the way I protect that is these minorities, these foreign Jews. They're really immigrants. They're not really us, they're other. And that's where the whole history of anti-Semitism before the modern time is important, because we've traced how Jews and why Jews are defined by the other. But at this secular stage, right, it's not theologically based. It's as Stacey said, socioeconomic. It's socioeconomically based, right? That and as people are suffering because of the globalizing economy, right? Because industrialization, I talked about that 2 weeks ago, that the common people are not catching up fast enough. They look at the Jews, oh, Jews are doing well. There are plenty of Jews who aren't doing well. But because some Jews were doing well, they shouldn't have those jobs. We should have those jobs. And that's what triggers the anti-Semitism and the discrimination. Class conflict turns to anti-liberalism. Not only did progress in education animate many millions of formerly uneducated citizens, he writes, it also stroked their hatred of Jews. So here, this is the problem with public education. That public education, because the idea of the public education system is that it's the antidote to class conflict. The idea of public education is that anyone gets an education, and then the meritocracy supersedes the aristocracy, right? Like if I get good grades and I'm smart, then I can get the best jobs, and then I can be successful. I don't have to be born into a high-class family in order to do that. In America, we call that the American dream, right? But that was the sense of the rise of the common people is through education. So the problem is, how does that stoke their hatred of Jews? Because when the majority goes into the system and sees that the other are doing better, and they say, well, that's not fair, and the minorities tend to do better in a meritocracy, in a merit-based system, because it's part of the minority mentality that you tend to work harder, right? And you want to achieve more. And we certainly see that, in so many examples of that. And the Jews were a primary example. And it's still true today, right? The Jews generally spend more time in school and have a higher graduation rate than the population at large. So that stokes hatred. His argument is that before there was compulsory education, when the common people were, lived and died their lives serving in farms, or they didn't, their appetite's not whetted for more, which education does. Let me continue. In class conflicts between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, less mobile citizens rose up against the more inventive, talented, and successful in the name of justice and equality. It's no surprise then that the borders between socialists and nationalists, now those are my italics, because that's what Nazi stands for, National Socialist, collectivism remain permeable even today. The parties that ruled the European continent despised and attacked British liberalism, the liberalism that informs our culture in this country. They worshiped the concept of the people and rejected individualism as a vestigial remnant of an epic that had yet to be illuminated by the spirit of national solidarity. So this goes to that opening sort of overall question I said, is the Holocaust medieval or modern, right? The point here is that this type of socialist, nationalist, racist hatred is not like, oh, how could this happen in a modern world? We have principles of liberalism. They're saying, no, those ideas of liberalism and individualism is old, right? Those are vestigial remnants of an epic long gone. We're in the period now of national solidarity, when it's the people and the rights of the people are more important than the rights of the individual, and especially, of course, the majority people. And therefore, anti-Jewish slogans were an easy way to motivate masses of people. One second here, I just want to see. Masses of people, and they sat easily with the goal of, again, national and social, that's Nazi betterment. Once governments began protecting majorities against Jewish minorities, years of further discrimination was sure to follow. So this is here the line goes, the progression to what happens. The social rise of the European masses bolstered rather than lessened anti-Jewish resentment. So moving along here, democracies are not immune. People say, oh, well, Germany was a dictatorship. Bad things happen in dictatorships. Bad things don't happen in democracies. The democracy guarantees that a democratic republic would never do the bad things that happen in dictatorships. He says, don't be so quick to say that. Conditions for the racial segregation and ultimately homicidal hatred of Jews, right? It ultimately turned to murder, are not unique to authoritarian, totalitarian, or dictatorial states. Parliaments and governments in democratically organized nation states also saw nothing amiss in following ethno-collectivist doctrines. There's a very, very important saying here, because in the wake of the Holocaust, many historians and social psychologists were looking at sort of the totalitarian mentality, that what brings a people to want to follow a dictator like an Adolf Hitler. And because dictators, right? Why would they go along with that? And what Ali is saying here is it's really not just about authoritarian. It's not about authoritarianism, totalitarianism, dictatorship. It's just about an anti-Semitism, which is an element of envy and hatred of others and greed. And that's something that's true everywhere. And so many of the examples that he gives in the book are about the cases where parliaments voted for the anti-Jewish laws, where democracies voted to restrict Jewish rights. So it didn't happen only where you're afraid of the dictator, and that's a dark truth that comes out of the history. Here he argues, anyone who thinks that modern anti-Semitism has nothing to do with aspects of political and economic progress will be unable to understand the ideology or plausibly describe its pandemic spread. I like this quotation because pandemic, of course, has a lot of meaning for us now that he wasn't thinking of when he wrote this book a few years ago. But he's making the point there. He's saying that this is not the same anti-Semitism as the theological, religious anti-Semitism of the Middle Ages. This is something very different in the modern times. Yes, it grows from that, but it has to do with the changes in politics and the changes in the economy and the class conflict and the masses and the nationalization and all of that. And then there's the role of the war. So he says, along with the growing anti-Semitism in so many nations of Europe, another central precondition, like what are the preconditions for the Holocaust, was required for genocide to occur, right? It's not enough that there was all this hatred and discrimination. You also needed a war. And the Second World War and its furious destructive force, that's the argument that Christopher Browning makes in this book, Ordinary Men, against Daniel John Goldhagen in Hitler's Willing Executioners, right? Browning's argument is that ordinary people don't participate in genocide, but it's the context of being in a war that radicalizes people and they lose their moral safeguards, right? And they do things in war that they would never imagine doing if they weren't in a war, and that it lets out this sort of leashes this breakdown of the civilization. That's why the discussions about the laws of war, the ethics of war, always, there are rules, but then that's always an interesting philosophical discussion is there such a thing as ethics of war? And there's a lot of discussion now of it, of course, because of is there a distinction between the war crimes that's, that we're seeing that the Russians are committing in the Ukraine. But then there are other too. They're saying there are some weapons Ukrainians use that are considered not permitted. I forget what it was. It's an explosive that spreads the shrapnel out of it. I forget the term for it. Anyway, I'm not trying to equate, of course, the Ukrainians and Russians. I'm just saying that every war brings up this philosophical discussion. The point is that war brings people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. And that's the other precondition to genocide. And here he makes a very strong point here. Germany bears sole responsibility for the war, as it does not for anti-Semitism per se. Right? As a very, very strong statement coming from a German historian. He's saying Germany is responsible for World War II. There's no question about that. But Germany is not solely responsible for the anti-Semitism that was turned against the Jews in the Holocaust. Yes, of course, Germany is guilty, but there are a lot of other places, a lot of other people in other countries are guilty too. And that anti-Semitism was widespread. The war was what lowered people's inhibitions against committing acts of violence, fueled their fantasies about internal enemies and traitors, encouraged their covetousness of other people's belongings. It was in part the conditions created by war that paralyzed the consciences of so many Christians, so that thinking in brutal friend-enemy dichotomies and jaded shoulder shrugging indifference to others' suffering became the norm. As what people say, how could Christian Europe commit the Holocaust? Right, and it's so unchristian, and the term that Christians use is ethical, and he's saying because the war breaks down your conscience that you would normally have. So again, this collaboration or collusion, collaboration isn't the fully adequate term for the interplay of native forces and occupiers. It's more accurate to speak of a coincidence of specific interests. In the middle of a cataclysmic war, the murder of millions of people allowed the governments of the countries affected by it to reallocate more than 1 million places to live, mostly in cities. And this is now where the economic aspect of it, right? He's saying that by the places that the countries the Germans occupied, then they worked with the countries to expropriate the Jewish, to expel the Jews, deport them. The Germans said, we'll take the Jews and you can take all of the Jews' houses and apartments and assets and distribute it among your people. And what he argues is that, and this goes to that question, are the Nazis being irrational or rational? This is the rationality that they're doing. It was a strategy. It's not just driven by this irrational hatred that, I want to, we should kill all the Jews, make Germany Judenrein, right, pure of Jews. It was an occupational strategy. The strategy was, if we expropriate all the assets of the Jews, then the occupying countries are now our clients because We're now in business together, a criminal business, but in business together. And that's the key point that he's saying, that this gave millions of places to live. And there are cases where the Nazis always took their take, the Germans took their take, but the higher German authorities said the mass of the assets had to be given to the local population. And that way, the local population, the idea was they wouldn't be engaging in resistance against the German occupiers, because now they're colluding together because they've been paid off. And that's the very controversial but original argument that Gutzeli is making. So, greed. Throughout Europe, including, of course, Germany, Nazi leaders had made as many people as they could into profiteers of Jewish persecution. Those who had taken over the job of a deported office worker, a business or apartment, or borne off winter clothing or furnishings, didn't as a rule protest against Nazi inhumanity. Right? If you took something, then you're not going to criticize the morality of the person that you took the handoff from. The only thing and most people took, because people have greed. The only thing that interested such people was that the Jews were gone for good. The leaders of Nazi Germany counted on this effect. They knew too well from their own experience of buying popular support by distributing the assets of German Jews that sharing such spoils shored up cooperation between occupiers, the people, and their political offices. It encouraged a bandit morality within a conspiratorial community from which it was very difficult to break free once people had taken the bait. Right? A bandit morality is interesting. Now, again, this is the extremes. This idea of a government buying people off happens all the time, right? When we get tax breaks, when there are, the government support, so that the idea is that the government invests in the people, not just to make society better, but also to buy the support of the people, right? That's something that governments will always do, especially those that want to remain in power in democratic systems. So that goes back to that idea, like, what is it about the sort of the nationalist, democratic, liberal program that can be used for good things to happen, but also for bad things? And then on this, Hitler himself, this quotation shouldn't be underestimated. And this is in the case where he's, he talks about this, where they're giving instructions to the Hungarians, that the Hungarians want to get rid of all of the Jewish refugees that aren't Hungarian. And when Hitler and the Nazis say to the Hungarians, actually, and then in Croatia as well, he says, no, you want to get rid of the ones who live in your country because those are the ones that have the assets, and you want to expropriate the assets. And then in Croatia, it says they wanted to get, I read you this, he says they wanted to get rid of the, in terms of dealing with the Jewish question. And it says, we can send experienced experts on the Jewish question. But he rejected the idea of deporting Jews who had immigrated into Croatia, fleeing other countries after 1914. He said, the most money is with the other ones, is another quotation from Hitler, meaning it's the actual Croatian Jews you want to get rid of, because it's the Jews that are established, right? And this is why it always says, like, how come in Germany, where the Jews were so assimilated, did so well, why does the Holocaust happen there? Because that's where there was all the envy, right? The better the Jews are doing, the more that drives the envy and the greed of those that don't do as well. Another place, I didn't put the quotation down, he makes the arguments that it's the well-to-do minority is hated most in societies that are over, where the majority is failing and not doing well. Here, in most cases, it was the increasingly successful prosecution of the war against the Wehrmacht, it's the German army, and not any moral qualms that saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of acutely threatened Jews. When the European countries stopped collaborating and started to protect Jews, and they did, and hundreds of thousands of Jews were saved at the end of the war, it's not because they suddenly realized the morality of and what was happening, of the moral depravity of sending the Jews for deportation and found out what was going on at Auschwitz. It's because they knew that the Allies were defeating Nazi Germany, and that Nazi Germany was going down, So they were trying to hide their complicity with the crimes that they really were complicit in with the Nazis. And then this is the paradox that he ends the book with, that evil arises not only from evil, but also from what is basically good, right? That's this biggest controversy. He says he's leaving this as food for thought. Well-intentioned educational policies and state-supported desires to lift the masses socially, this is democracy, right, education, both of which can be counted among 20th century Europe's great triumphs, serve to increased hatred, right? And this is an answer to the question, why does the Holocaust happen in modern times? Right? It's like seems medieval. He says, no, it's modern. And it's not just because of industrialization, it's because of the idea of nationalist self-interest. The same is also true of the best political ideas and those most deserving of continuation: democracy, liberty, popular participation, self-determination, social equality. He's not saying these are bad things, these are wonderful things, but we have to make sure we use them for good and not for bad. The greatest crime of the 20th century, the Holocaust, is connected to the greatest achievement of the same epoch, namely the social elevation of masses of people under the extreme pressure of the war, begun and led by Germany. What had moved civilization forward had also brought about its destruction. And that's the conclusion. Well, let me fix my screen here, sorry. That is the conclusion of this. And I want to just read one last thing and then we'll save. I did want to spend some time for us to talk here, some reactions. The end of the other book, Why the Germans, Why the Jews, he's more personal in that book, where he focuses more on Germany. And the book I was reading you from, he's talking about all the European countries overall. And he talks about his own grandfather being, was involved with in the Nazi regime and what it means as a German to deal with this history. And then he goes to his conclusion here on, this is his last page of this book here. Today's generations of Germans owe a lot to their ancestors' desires to get ahead in the world. Precisely for that reason, there is no way for them to divorce anti-Semitism from their family histories. And then he talks about envy. Envy, fear of failure, resentment, and greed fueled German anti-Semitism. These were forces of evil. And then in this book, he extends it to all the other countries in Europe. These were forces of evil that mankind has feared and has tried to rein in with civilization since the dawn of time. Germans, connected as they were to the traditions of Christianity and Roman law, were aware of the base motivations behind their Jew hatred and were rightly ashamed of it. That, however, made them all the more receptive to racial theory, biopolitical pseudoscience disguised hatred as insight, and made one's own shortcomings seem like virtues. Right? Because you say, oh no, there is a genetic explanation to why one people are more superior to other peoples, and you can hide behind that science of racism. That, however, made biopolitical pseudoscience disguised hatred as insight. It made one's own shortcomings seem like virtues. It also provided justification for acts of legal discrimination against others, allowing millions of Germans to delegate their own aggression, born of feelings of inferiority and shame, to their state. Representatives of that state relieved people of their responsibilities as individuals and transformed individual malice into a collective need to find a final solution to the Jewish question. And then his last paragraph here, Cain killed his brother Abel because he felt disadvantaged and unjustly treated by God, right? It's right at the beginning of the Bible. It's the first murder. Cain kills Abel because Abel gives a sacrifice and God likes Abel's sacrifice. God doesn't like Cain's sacrifice. So Cain is jealous, he kills Abel. The first murder in the history of humanity was born of envy and the need to feel equal. The mortal sin of envy, together with a belief in collective happiness, modern science, specific techniques of political rules, what made the systematic mass murder of European Jews possible, right? That's the dark side of the Holocaust. That it's not this medievalism, it's the idea of equality that triggers the dark side of equality is envy. If I believe that everyone should be equal, right? We grew up that way as Americans, all men created equal, right? Was endowed with inalienable rights. But if I really believe that, and I see that some people are doing better than I am, then what do I do with that? I try to make society better, or I discriminate. Protective tariffs and the domestic version of that. Okay, let me continue from here. There's no way around the pessimistic conclusion that evil can never be quarantined once and for all in a way that would rule out such horrors. Another event structurally similar to the Holocaust could still occur. Those who want to reduce the danger of its happening should work to understand the complex human preconditions of the Holocaust. And they should not kid themselves into thinking that the anti-Semites of the past were completely different from who we are today. All right, that's the most important lesson there, right? That don't think that the anti-Semites of the Holocaust were any different than people today, right? People today, since the beginning of time, since Cain and Abel, were capable of giving in to their jealousy to the point of murder of other people. And there's no, wanting to be equal, wanting fairness is a good thing to want. But that's why having a society is running and forming a just society is hard work. And rather than find the simple solutions, the easy explanations, well, it's just because of Hitler. Well, this was because it was a dictatorship. Well, this was because of Christian anti-Semitism. No, those are excuses. That the darker truth is people are capable of lashing out against others. You only have to look on the TV now to see examples of that. All right, again, as I said, I didn't realize that this class would be the week of Yom HaShoah, but it works, it does work nicely. And I open it up for comments, questions. So as I said, if this were a regular class, we would all read it and, we would have been digested it and we could see who didn't understand. So I apologize. We went through, there's a lot of text I was going through today rather than sort of putting it together. But there are so many different ways of looking at the Holocaust. It's the hardest thing to understand. But I wanted to look at this was what I think a very useful interpretive way of understanding it and understanding what the lessons are from it. And I thought that was more, worth our time than just going through the statistics and what happened in this place and what happened.
Rabbi, could you hold up the book again, please? Could you hold
Sure.
up?
So the book, the newest one is this. It's Europe Against the Jews, 1880 to 1940. And then the other one that focuses on the German side is Why the Germans, Why the Jews. So it's both by, the author's name is Götz Ali, A-L-Y. So, and the English to translate, it's readable. The English it's a good translation from the German, and it's not overly technical. It's not half of the book as the footnotes. The footnotes are really just where what he's quoting from. So they are very, very, very readable, even though it's a very difficult story that he's telling. Hannah Benish, I see the hand up there. That you're on mute though. I don't know if you're speaking there. I can't hear you because you're on mute. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'll let you fix the mute because you're still on mute. David Weiss, I see your hand up.
Okay, now.
Oh, you got it.
Okay.
You got it. Go ahead.
You mentioned that Germany bears sole responsibility for World War II. Are you just considering Europe, the European theater? Because what about Japan? And what about Italy?
Yeah.
What about
in the European theater? Again, that's from Ellie. It's one would expect a German historian to put responsibility on Germany, right? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how that works, that after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles insisted that Germans accept responsibility for World War I, which really wasn't fair because that was across the board. Everyone was mutually responsible for World War I, and that caused a lot of resentment in Germany. After World War II, there was no treaty that demanded anyone take responsibility, but over time, the next generation of Germans did, out of moral reasons, accept responsibility. So I can't imagine a German historian not accepting German responsibility. The context there is World War. It is the European theater, not the Pacific theater, which falls on the Japanese. It's a good question versus Italy. I mean, Mussolini's Italy was involved in wars of conquest that were, in North Africa. That was expanding, Italy's space. But I don't know that it would. I think it was the alliance with Rome was formed before the war started, and the war formally starts when Germany invades Poland. So it's the series of actions that Hitler takes, first with the moving German soldiers into the Rhineland, which was demilitarized, which is the border with France after World War I, and then with the annexation of Austria, which was also forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles, and then the Sudetenland, which was the portion of Western Czechoslovakia where there were German speakers, and then there was the Munich Accord. They said, okay, you take that, then conquering the rest of Czechoslovakia, and then invading Poland. And at that point, France and Britain declare war on Germany, because at that point it's clear that Hitler's not going to stop. So that's what he's referring to, that it's those series of actions against all of the treaties and all of the agreements with the Allies, which is what triggered the start of the war. Yeah, Japan had already invaded China, and that was a different conflict that then gets combined. So that's,
and of course Pearl Harbor. But I mean, I agree about the Holocaust, but about World War II, unless you specify European.
Yeah, it's interesting. He doesn't specify, because when Germans talk about World War II, they're not thinking about Japan. For us as Americans, it's very different, right? Because our entry was because of the Japanese attack. So that's a very, very interesting point. And that's all the perspective of the historian, where the perspective comes in. Excellent. David Weiss. But I still can't hear you, David. You have to unmute.
Done speaking? Uh-oh.
Yeah, I can't see you anymore, but I know what you look like.
Okay, but you can hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, so you raised the issue of equality, and it plays out, like in our newspapers every single day. And the issue of equality of opportunity compared to the equality of results plagues our country today.
Well, and yeah, right, and that's those issues of that the idea of equity and political equity, social equity, socioeconomic equity. I mean, those are pressures against every democracy, right? Because and I think the argument that he's saying is that's where, when in a democratic system, right, if you get people are going to vote for a politician or a party that's basically best for their own pocketbooks. And that's that greed motivation that he says, and that's how it plays out in the equity politics of a democratic system. And yeah, we see strains of that in the United States, absolutely. We see it also in again, I don't want to take sides with the Democratic and the Republican line, because I'll get in trouble, especially with David here. But I think it's fair to say that it's not. The part of the partisan line is cities, right, against a middle America. And we see, when you look at the map, right, between the red map and the blue map, those designs, you can see that there, and everyone says, why are things so partisan and more partisan and more partisan? Why can't we understand that we're all Americans, we're all in it together? And yes, but when we see, how those maps are drawn, right, and where voters are, and overall, you can see that it's the division of the populace into different components, and they're voting for their interests. And that's a natural process of popular democratic electoral system. And that's what I think the overall point he's trying to say, that in the old world system, where where it wasn't, governments weren't dependent on popular approval. They were immune from these type of hatreds. And that's the dark side of the movement for democracy, that we say just because people are able to vote doesn't mean that they're going to always vote for the right thing. They're going to vote what's there in their interests. So, and we to bring it close to home, I mean, after the Oslo Accords, and everyone had such a high that we were moving towards the final, finally to have peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And what the Americans were pushing for was, and the Palestinians now have to have elections. They have to have national elections. And then their leadership is going to represent what good people want rather than what just Yasser Arafat. And then what happened? The people elected Hamas. And then we said, oh, no, we don't mean that kind of election, And then we're still in the situation where we are now. And we've seen that also with the Arab Spring and developments in Iraq. So it's democracy is very, very complicated. And it's what it goes to, I said it before, it's Winston Churchill's famous comment that he says, democracy is a terrible, terrible system of government. It's just better than any of the alternatives. I think those two hands we answered. Any other comments before we leave for the night? Thank you very much. So we have two more classes, right? We have two. Sorry, go ahead. I see a hand. Go ahead. Yeah.
I see two dangers. One is from the extreme left of the Jewish community, and the other is the extreme right, and they both relate to Muslims in a way. And so the extreme left I'll deal with first, and that is getting too cozy with the Black Lives Matter movement and wokeism in general, especially when it gets to intersectionality and painting the state of Israel as the ultimate pariah and apartheid state, and the Palestinians as the poster child of oppression and that sort of thing. Then there's the right wing, where there are certain politicians. There's a politician, very young politician named Laura Loomer, who was defeated very badly by another older Jewish politician, Lois Frankel in Florida, in the Palm Beach area. But she is anti-Muslim. She makes no bones about being anti-Muslim. And I think it's very dangerous for Jewish people to be automatically anti-Muslim or anti-anything. Because there's that old saying, first they came for so-and-so, and then
sure, absolutely.
So those are the two. Those are both very dangerous at the two extremes.
No, both extremes are absolutely. So anyway, it's also a good teaser, because the next session, which is I think it is next week, a week from tonight, which is May 2nd already. I'm going to talk about anti-Semitism in Israel. So we're going to talk about anti-Israel and how to understand the growth of anti-Semitism in the Arab world. We talked about the beginning of the class, so we'll explore that type of anti-Semitism next class, and then we take 2 weeks off. And the last class will be May 23rd, which is the last Monday before Memorial Day. And then we'll talk about anti-Semitism here at home in the United States. We'll sort of see what it all means for us. So again, thanks for sticking with us for the journey. Okay. We got two left.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very informative.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Laila Tov.